Yes, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you being here. As he said, my title is "This is War, You're Part of It." That's a quote from a Ukrainian civil society leader to a group of international journalists that were gathered at an event at the beginning of the Euromaidan protests. And I think it's a really interesting way to sum up the intricate relationship that media and conflict have, and how, especially what they've had in the recent conflicts in Ukraine. So the subtitle is "Mediatization of Ukraine's Crises." An alternative subtitle I'm thinking of was the conflict between alternative and mainstream media before, during, and after Ukraine's Euromaidan. So that's just another way to think about it. So this is a roadmap, just really quick overview of what I'll talk about. First, I'll go straight to the end and give you my thesis. Then I'll walk back from the beginning and give you my theoretical approach to it, and then the chronology of how Ukrainian media has developed, paying special attention to alternative versus mainstream media there. Then, so we'll go through all those three stages. Then we'll talk about Ukrainian government and its information sphere. Then I'll give some analysis and why it matters. So here's my thesis summed up in one really long run-on sentence. I claim that the third phase of mediatization is unlikely to occur in Ukraine because Ukrainian mainstream media is incapable of appropriating alternative media due to, number one, the mainstream media's underdevelopment, and number two, the robustness of alternative media since the Euromaidan protests. The second part of my thesis has to do with the Ukrainian government, which I argue has shown signs of the third phase of mediatization. So what are these phases, and what is mediatization? So my paper is essentially a theoretical approach to the changing dynamics of Ukraine's media landscape. I looked through a lot of different media theories to try to find some way to organize and underscore my findings, and I came across this work by Andrew Hoskins and Ben O'Loughlin, who are both media theorists at the University of Cambridge. They wrote a book in 2010 titled "War in Media, The Emergence of Diffused War," and then they followed that up with an article in 2015 titled "Arrested War, the Third Phase of Mediatization." So these two works give us a conceptual framework which I use to, again, organize, and we can use this framework to view the macro changing dynamics in Ukraine or any country's media landscape, I'd say. I chose them as opposed to other theorists because I really felt like their work was really good at getting at how conflict, media, and society are all connected, and how conflict works as a catalyst for changing for the media landscape. Oftentimes when things change in the media world in a country, it's because of a conflict, and I think they're the best ones that really get at that the most clearly. So what is mediatization? Mediatization occurs when war, conflict, or some other sort of event becomes so tightly integrated with the media and the perception of the conflict that the two are inextricable. There are three phases of mediatization. The first phase is broadcast era, which is mostly in the 1990s. Broadcast era was mostly characterized by big media, CNN, BBC. There was a really strict top-down hierarchy, organization management of these organizations. Hoskins and O'Loughlin say it's a contained media ecology of discrete monodirectional media, and there was limited ability for challenge to the mainstream. And that's exactly what happened in the second phase, was that there was a challenge to the mainstream. That's diffused era. It's characterized by proliferation of new media technologies and therefore new media outlets. Essentially anyone could become a reporter or a journalist because of the new technologies that were proliferating during this time. They said, well, I think the meteorite known as digital hit the world, and there was an explosion of content and representation of events, and it just caused a lot of chaos in that sense. And that brings a lot of new uncertainties to the society that the media operates within. And we'll talk more about that in a second. Third phase is arrested era. That's what we're in now. They describe this saying that the center has adapted and come back stronger than before. Mainstream is the new media ecology, they say. It's once again the new media ecology. It's back to the mainstream because they have appropriated user-generated content, and it's all the chaotic dynamics that go with that, and they've been absorbed by the mainstream media. The data deluge, therefore, is a lot less threatening in the third phase. These are ideal phases. Of course, they don't occur without overlap and some mix amongst them, but I still think they're really good ways to conceptualize what's happening in a very macro way to media in many different countries, and we'll talk about Ukraine specifically. So the other aspect of this theory that I wanted to highlight was the fact that there's greater uncertainty in decision-making when you're in the second phase of mediatization. When there's a lot of different representation of events and no one really knows what necessarily the truth is, there's not really good unbiased media coverage, then that's problematic for governments, businesses, individuals. Decision-making becomes a lot more complicated when you don't have one trusted main flow of information in a country. So we'll talk more about that. Communication used to be on tap, but now it's a lot less linear, and it's a lot harder for decision making when that's the case. So now we'll launch into the chronological representation of kind of how Ukrainian media has changed over the decades. I'm not going to go into too much detail about what happened in the early 90s, but the main thing to know is that while Ukraine abolished censorship when it became independent, there was still a predominance of Russian media during this time, and that continued till the mid-90s. That was at the time Leonid Kuchma then became president, and he did a lot of blitz privatization of the media sector, but it was very opaque and not transparent at all, and it only helped a pretty small sector of his close friends. We'll talk more about the oligarchs in more detail later, but that's the other factor. In my paper, I also mention the different identity crises that Ukraine kind of went through in that period, between being Western, being residual Soviet identity, or a new Ukrainian identity. So all of these things, the Russian media predominance, the oligarchs coming to power, all served to kind of pull early Ukrainian independent media in many different directions, which is not a really good first step when you're trying to create a healthy, pluralistic media landscape. Then came the Orange Revolution. Michael McFaul, I think, had an interesting quote saying the Orange Revolution may have been the first to be largely organized online. And even though Ukraine didn't have a very big internet penetration during this time, it was still, internet and social media was still a big tool in the Orange Revolution. So that kind of was a first step in creating a more diverse and kind of chaotic media field. Also during that time, during the Orange Revolution, there was a proliferation of citizen journalism as well. Kanal 5, Pravda, Observatel, Per UA are some that came about during the Orange Revolution. So the Orange Revolution was kind of a first step in setting the stage between a conflict between media, mainstream media, and alternative media. So that's a really brief overview of kind of the first step of mainstream media development and its initial contact with the alternative media. So what else, moving on kind of a little bit further down the road, Ukraine media before Euromaidan, it's generally dominated by television. A study done in 2013 showed that 90% of Ukrainians get their news media from television, so my paper focuses mostly on that. There are 15 non-satellite nationwide broadcast TV channels in Ukraine today, which is 2.5 times more than a comparable country of Poland, which means more competition for revenue and advertising and viewership. 6 of those 15 have over half the viewership of the Ukrainian population, and of those 6, most of them are owned by oligarchs, private media. So Inter TV, 1+1, TRT, STV, you guys probably know of most of those. Those are all owned by major oligarchs, and those dominate the news media landscape. The largest state-owned news media is UT1, recently rebranded to UA First, and that's the 7th most popular television channel with the audience share of only 3.39%, so it's pretty small. Really quickly about newspapers. Newspapers are generally dominated by the Russian market in Ukraine. Of course, the most widely circulated daily newspaper is Fakti Komentari, which is a native Ukrainian newspaper, but the close one behind it is Argumenty Fakti, which is just the Ukrainian language version of a Russian paper. A couple of the other top newspapers in Ukraine are Russian, either in Russian language or Ukrainian language versions of Russian papers. So newspapers are really heavily dominated by Russia. And then just in general, influence of Russian media is outsized in Ukraine. Before Euromaidan, I'll talk more about how it's changed in the period during and after as well. But in the East especially, a lot of Russian television channels are really popular. And so there continues to be a lot of influence of Russian media in Ukraine. An inordinate amount compared to other former Soviet bloc nations. So another bit about media before Euromaidan, social media and the internet. Ukraine has limited penetration of internet. Only about 42% of the country qualifies as internet users, according to the World Bank. In 2009, the level of usage was 20% lower than the average European rate. Most users live in big cities. A third of all internet users live in Kiev, so it's extraordinarily concentrated in the big cities. Social media, it's pretty standard for most former Soviet countries. Kontaktia is the most popular, but close behind is Facebook, and then Twitter is least popular before Euromaidan, but it gains in popularity. So that's all pretty standard. Rise of the oligarchs. This is a thing that's very much not standard. Ukraine media is heavily dominated by people whose money is not earned just through media. It's earned through other industries, many other sectors, So their interests lie outside of the media sector, and that's negative for the development of a solid, good, healthy mainstream media ecology in Ukraine. So these are three, Pinchuk, Akhmetov, and Kolomoisky. I'm not going to go into which outlets they own, but they all own the major outlets, and it's not a good thing if you want to have, again, a really strong media outlet, and of course their political orientations also affect the mainstream media, the way it works in Ukraine as well. Then also legislation, the main thing to know, it's interesting, based on the letter of the law, Ukraine actually has quite progressive media laws, but unfortunately they aren't enforced as that in that way. There's a lot of uncertainty about rule of law, there's a lot of corruption between journalists, editors, politicians, everything, so it's not as healthy of a relationship between legislation and the media as you'd like it to be, and there's really very little protection for journalists. You probably know about Georgy Kangadze from Ukrainska Pravda, who was killed in 2000, was essentially killed with impunity. So that's just a brief overview, again, showing how underdeveloped the mainstream media in Ukraine has been in the period leading up to Euromaidan. So Euromaidan, we know already about the role of social media. Of course, Facebook was the main way that people learned about the initial protests. Ukrainian journalist Mustafa Naim put a post on November 22nd, 2013, which called people to come to Maidan for the first big protest. Facebook was a medium for coordinating activities and protests. Social media, a really interesting quote, social media connected people to first-hand accounts, became the only way to learn the truth about Yanukovych and events at Maidan. So again, social media was kind of the first step in undermining mainstream media's role during Euromaidan. So what did the mainstream do during Euromaidan? Mainstream outlets oftentimes contradicted themselves. There are many instances where a couple months before the protest started, they would say, it's good for us to pursue an association agreement with the EU, and then a couple months later would say, actually, we should really focus on our relationship with Russia. So this showed the owners' alliances changing, and it was really confusing for viewers to, you can't, if a media station keeps changing its position, it's not good for the viewership, and people then lose trust, and the outlet loses legitimacy. So another thing that added to that losing of trust was that there was very little airtime given to protests and to opposition leaders and to dissident leaders in general. The time actually, as the protests continued on and as Euromaidan increased in climax, less and less time was given on some stations to the protests and to dissident leaders, and interviews were hardly ever granted. For the main channels, of course, this is not true of all of them, but the other aspect of mainstream is that there's dissident activities by professional journalists. This is activities outside the scope of that outlet. So a lot of journalists wrote letters appealing to management for them to report more truthfully and to not get involved, for editorial policies to remain indifferent from the events at Euromaidan, and for them encouraging the outlet to do more unbiased reporting. And then there was also an instance that's interesting, is the raiding of Yanukovych's mansion, which was done primarily by a group of journalists from different outlets who weren't working to get the scoop, weren't working to get the first story, but instead were working outside of the province of their own outlet in order to expose what they thought was really important information about Yanukovych and his leadership. So these are all also working to undermine the Ukrainian mainstream media, because when journalists are operating outside the scope and their editors can't get a hold on what they're doing, then it's obviously not good. It doesn't look good, and all of that led to decreased viewership and decreased trust in the media in Ukraine during Euromaidan. What further added to that was the rise of alternative media. So there's so many examples of this, but I think the most clear was Hromadske Telebachenia, which is a streaming service. It's a joint project from a couple Ukrainian journalists, launched in 2013, operated as a YouTube channel but has moved on. It's funded by donations and foreign grants, was a popular source of information during Maidan. That was just skyrocketed in popularity during the Euromaidan protests, because it showed live accounts, live streaming of the speeches and protests, everything. Radio Aristokrati was started by two guys who were journalists who started an internet radio station that they said specifically they started because they felt like the mainstream media wasn't doing enough to cover the events at Euromaidan. And the other two, again, Ukrainska Pravda was an outlet before, but it skyrocketed in popularity during Euromaidan. In 2014, February 2014, 2.5 million people visited the site in one day alone, and now it has around 1.5 million visitors daily. And then Novoye Vremya is a social and political weekly news magazine, also very popular. So after Euromaidan, mainstream media was further debilitated. It didn't do a good job covering events at Euromaidan, and then as we talk about the war in the East, didn't do a good job covering that as well. The biggest thing that kind of undermined Ukrainian mainstream media was professionalism versus patriotism. A lot of journalists chose to choose patriotism instead. They oftentimes went to the front, felt like they could help more there than they could by providing unbiased coverage of the events in eastern Ukraine. They were entering a crisis of values. There was Ukrainian flags signed by soldiers hanging on newsroom walls. There was spent shells and flak jackets in newsrooms, which is not something you usually should see in a newsroom. There was also limited accessibility for journalists in Donetsk and Luhansk. There was a lot of violence against journalists there, of course. It was too expensive and too risky for a lot of outlets to send their own journalists, so they instead relied on news reports from 2 or 3 major news agencies, which then led to a lot of overgeneralization of what was happening. So that really also served to make the mainstream not do a good job covering the war in the East. And of course, it was still owned by a handful of oligarchs as well. So alternative media, again, there's a lot going on here. I could pick a million things, but liveuamap.com is a really good example. I encourage you all to check it out. It's made by 2 software engineers in Dnipropetrovsk. They are described as a non-profit, volunteer-run civic project of civic journalism. And then stopfake.com, of course, checks and refutes information that it finds in the Russian and Ukrainian press. It's a small crowdsourced project as well. The other big thing to know about media after Euromaidan was the influence of outside actors. So computer-assisted reporting is a very 21st century development where anyone can become a verified reporter by using Google Earth, social media, Google Maps, things like this. A good example is Bellingcat.com. You all probably know about it. Elliot Higgins is a UK citizen who covered events in Syria and then Ukraine, and he works with a team of people who can help geolocate a video of a missile launch and compare it to Google Earth images of that same area and to prove that a missile was launched there. And that's what they did to create their report on MH17 and the downing of that using a Buk missile that was brought by a Russian brigade out of Kursk. In general, MH17 saw a lot of unconventional open sourced reporting about it. There was a number of Ukrainian civil society groups that also got involved, and Dutch prosecutors said they would seriously study claims made by these groups using their open source intelligence. So last little bit before I go into my analysis. So that's all happening. There's also a parallel development within the Ukrainian government itself. So while alternative and mainstream media are struggling with each other, the Ukrainian media, I argue, is essentially making its own information space. They created the Ministry of Information Policy in December 2014, which was headed by Yuri Stets, who used to be a producer at Kanal 5, which is owned by Poroshenko. He said the purpose of the Ministry of Information Policy is to destroy separatism and protect the country's information and communication space from enemy attacks. He says he wants to create a national information product, and he has created the Ukrainian Information Army, iarmy.org, in order to combat Russian information warfare aimed at Ukraine. Ukraine Tomorrow is another thing he promised to launch, which is a cheeky response to Russia Today, Ukraine Tomorrow. It's another public diplomacy effort to try to shape the narrative around what is happening to Ukraine. The Ministry of Defense also is involved in this. They have limited access to the ATO zone in eastern Ukraine, of course, and then they also started an embedded journalism project where journalists sign contracts and move in with units from the Ukrainian National Army. And of course, this is a common practice for many countries, but the contracts they sign are known to be more strict and really try to control what the journalist then writes. So that's a really quick overview of Ukrainian government. General analysis, I'll provide. This is my, bringing it back to Hoskins and O'Loughlin, having gone through all this chronicle of what's happened to Ukrainian media, mainstream and alternative, and then what the government is doing, I argue that Ukraine remains in the second phase of mediatization. The landscape is really chaotic and fragmented and disjointed. The mainstream is really weak and the alternative media is very robust. I believe there's a very little likelihood of the appropriation of the alternative by the mainstream media, of the mainstream media by the alternative by the mainstream media. So as a result, I think that Ukraine will continue to have a chaotic and kind of unbalanced landscape. No strong or trusted mainstream media I don't think will happen in the near future. At the same time, while that is happening, I believe the Ukrainian government has entered the third phase in the sense of they have appropriated information for their own purposes. This is, of course, in part due to the information warfare they're experiencing on behalf of Russia, but I argue the other part of it is that there's no single trusted mainstream media information flow within Ukraine for them to rely on. There's a lot of different opinions and different representations, so it's hard for them to rely on that, so they instead make their own, essentially, media themselves, which we saw in those developments. So why does this matter? I'll just do this is my last one, I promise. The main thing to note here, I've worked for a couple of different journalism here in the US, journalism outlets, and the one thing that we always say was the only product a journalism outlet actually has is its reputation. So without a good reputation, then you're essentially not doing your job. And we can see that in Ukraine, the mainstream media has been so undermined and delegitimized and not trusted, and so that's not really good for a society to build on. So I think that alternative media will continue to flourish, mainstream media will continue to be underdeveloped, like I said. An increase in alternative journalism may mean increased respect for freedom of the press, but not increased trust in the press, which is important. That gets at, again, having the fourth estate, right? If that's healthy and strong in a society, that's a really important aspect to have, and we don't see that in Ukraine. And again, I think that we'll see continued institutionalized information warfare on the part of the Ukrainian government, which is something that obviously we may or may not want to see. It could be good or bad development, depends on how you look at it. But I think that this is all really interconnected. I think that the Ukraine crises were a good catalyst for this, and I think it's a really interesting that this theory about diffused and the different eras really put it all in a good perspective for us. So that's it.
Okay.
Okay.
Questions, comments,
Please.
reactions? Actually, you can get one more over there too.
Peter.
Renee, thank you for the very interesting presentation. Very good work. Really enjoyed it. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the primary means of communication for mass media to the Ukrainian population. Something that you noticed was that like a third of internet users are in Kiev alone. Does that mean that the majority of people in the provinces are relying on these sort of heavy centralized television companies or newspaper distribution, and what impact that would have in the diffusion of the Ukrainian media?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, that's the interesting thing, and something I was considering going more in depth in my paper, but kind of ran out of room, is I said 90% of Ukrainians rely on television as their main source of information. And I think that's especially true in the provinces, so that's a composite, obviously, of the whole country. So I would say that, yeah, people not in Kiev or Dnipropetrovsk or Kharkiv or wherever, I think that they probably rely mostly on the oligarch-owned popular media stations, and of course the widely circulated daily newspapers, which I mentioned, one of which is Ukrainian, one of which is the Russian version of a Ukrainian paper. So I think that that's the main means of communication with the majority of the public. And again, the state-run television in Ukraine doesn't have as big of a focus as it does in Russia, for example. So I don't think it's necessarily the government speaking to people directly that way. I think, again, it's this oligarch-owned information that's really prevalent for the public. As far as these other the Ukrainian government and what it was doing, I think it's unclear exactly how the Ministry of Information Policy spreads its information. It's still kind of a new project, so I think we'll see more direct channels of communication between the Ukrainian government and the people probably soon enough. Yes.
So you painted a pretty rosy picture of the role of social media in Euromaidan, and you quoted Martin Fall, and there was a lot of talk about the Twitter revolutions and the Arab Spring, and I'm personally pretty skeptical that social media changes fundamentally the dynamics of these kinds of events. But then you also were sort of more negative in talking about the fragmentation. But aren't the two linked in that, the fragmentation could really gotten a big boost?
That's totally true. Yeah, social media and its use definitely increases the fragmentation and the way people get their news from so many different sources. If social media is one of them, it obviously definitely increases the amount of fractionalization for sure. And I don't think that necessarily social media was the best way, is the best foot forward in the sense of creating a healthy media ecology, because again, it is so personalized and it's so siloed to one individual person, and it doesn't help create that general understanding that we're looking for. So I definitely don't think that social media is always like the promise. I agree with you. It's not necessarily the promise that some people put on it. It doesn't always have that. And it can be negative, as you said, in making it so that alternative media is or media consumption in general in the country becomes a lot more chaotic. Like, I mean, I look at my Twitter feed and I'm just totally overwhelmed by the news I get. And if that's happening in the context of a huge event like Euromaidan, I mean, it definitely exaggerates a lot of other factors as well. Yeah. Yes.
I'm fascinated by how far back the citizen journalism goes. I liked your recent historical perspective. And I'm wondering if you could clarify a little bit more some of the ways you're using that term, and not just historically, but now in terms of how you separate that out in the world of internet users and mass media and Twitter. So citizen journalism is a little bit better than that, but how do we define about it?
That's a really good question, and I do spend a little bit of time on that in my paper, defining alternative versus mainstream, and then within alternative, what that includes. And generally speaking, citizen journalism has to be somehow formalized in a sense of it. You can't be a prolific Twitter user and be considered a citizen journalist. Right. You know, you have to have at least some sort of outlet that is acknowledged and trusted, and you know, it has to be somehow solidified. And so either in a website or a newsletter or something like that, citizen journalism requires some sort of means, solid means, tangible means of communication. But alternative media, of course, is just media outside of the mainstream in the sense of it's not run by a large company, it's oftentimes crowdsourced or crowdfunded or funded by a small group of people. It's not run by the government and all that kind of stuff. So it's sometimes some things blur the lines, especially in Ukraine, because there's a lot of professional journalists who then became citizen journalists or alternative media producers. And so that's another way that further destabilized the mainstream media, because a lot of people essentially defected and were fed up with their mainstream coverage jobs, and then became more involved in the alternative side of things. So it's a lot of gray area, and it's kind of frustrating for me because I tried to limit my scope, but there's just so much interesting stuff happening and so many people producing it that it was hard to limit it. But.
Anyone else? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.